Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 20th of May of 2025. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the situation on the ground where the Russians continue their offensive operation. And first let's talk about the Zaporizhzhia direction where the Russians during the previous 24 hours once again intensified their activities. During the previous 24 hours we got lots of videos how the Russians were bombing and attacking the city of Orekhov from many directions. The Russians established complete control over the most southern part of the settlement. In this video we can see how the Russians were attacking Ukrainian units, Ukraine temporary deployment points in the area of the settlement by the name of Orekhov. So as for now we see that the Russians are trying to clear possible roads of attacks before the next several weeks. So most likely somewhere at the beginning of June, the Russians will try to make another breakthrough in this area with the purpose to get as deep as possible inside of the settlement by the name of Mala Takmachka, and probably the Russians will test Ukrainian defense between the lines of Novoandreevka and Novodanilovka. Now let's move further, let's talk about the South Donetsk direction, and first let's talk about the village of Zilon Polia. During the previous 24 hours the Russians managed to improve their position significantly, and this information was confirmed by pro-Ukrainian sources. According to pro-Ukrainian sources, according to the state more precisely, during the previous 24 hours the Russians managed to enter the southeastern part of Zilon Polia. So as you can see, according to breakthrough, the Russians were attacking from the south. So if we return back to the map, we see that the Russians, according to deep state, were attacking something like this, and the Russians entered the village, and currently there are very heavy clashes for the settlement. I'll remind you that yesterday we got the same reports from pro-Russian resources, but pro-Russian resources drew a bit other map. For example, according to pro-Russian resources, the armed force of the Russian Federation were attacking the village of Zilon Polia from the south and from the east, and the same story took place in the area of Novopol. So we see that Ukrainians are showing us completely different picture, and when talking about Ukrainian, let's say position Ukraine map, we see that according to this configuration of map, several Ukrainian soldiers, several Ukrainian units were caught in cauldron in the fields between the villages of Zilon Polia, Novopol, Novoselka and Rovnopol. So according to pro-Ukrainians, there is a pocket, we're talking about this area, where we can still find Ukrainian soldiers. Most likely they were caught in cauldron during the previous 48 hours. So this is the situation in this area. Obviously, if this information is correct, it will take time while when the Russians are able to clear this pocket completely, and of course it will take additional days to secure the village of Novopol and Zilon Polia themselves. So we expect that probably during the next week the Russians will finish both tasks. Now let's move further, let's talk about the South Donetsk direction itself. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions along the river of Mokraya Yali. So the Russians improved their positions, and as a result of another attack, the Russians outflanked the settlement of Fedorovka from the east and from the northeast. So we expect that the Russians are going to cross the river of Mokraya Yali and to attack Ukrainians from behind, which will lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian defense, and this will force the Ukrainians to fall back further in the northern direction towards the village of Kamar. So basically this is already not the Bogatyr direction, this is already the Kamar direction. We're talking about this village, which is located on many logistic roads, very important logistic roads for Ukrainians in this direction. As of now, the Russians continue offensive operation in the direction of Odradne. During the previous 24 hours we received lots of videos, lots of episodes how the Russians were bombing and attacking Ukrainian units in this area with lots of drones. Ukrainians suffered losses, and Ukrainians lost lots of vehicles and equipment. But despite Ukrainian losses, the Russians still haven't started even a single attempt to attack the village itself. So we believe that the Russians currently are trying to concentrate their forces along three lines in front of the settlement, but obviously this process will be finished in the very near future, and we expect that during the next 48-72 hours the Russians will make first attempts to attack the village itself from many directions. Furthermore, we expect that Ukrainians, due to all these losses, would be forced to fall back in the very near future, because we understand that most likely Ukrainians will not be able to hold their lines for a very long period of time. Furthermore, everything of course depends on the situation around Fedorovka. If the Russians are able to break through Ukrainian defense in the southeastern part of the village of Kamar, then most likely this situation will intensify Ukrainian probably movements in this area, and it will force the Ukrainians to fall back from Odradne much faster. Now let's talk about Alexeyevka. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians were bombing and attacking this village with FABs, with drones. So the Russians, as we can see, according to this geolocation, according to this video, established complete control over the settlement, trying to destroy for as many as possible Ukrainian positions. And the most important, the Russians are trying to hunt and destroy Ukrainian FPV drone operators' positions. After the Russians finish this mission, most likely they will begin another ground operation. So the situation here remains critical. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the area of Dnipro region. You know that during the previous 24 hours, the Russians published lots of very interesting videos. We have added both videos in the area of Selidova. Today the Russians start using new type of drone. So I'd like to point your attention to this drone, and this is new anti-drone drone, which main purpose of this drone is to discover and to destroy Ukrainian reconnaissance drone and the drone of type of Baba Yaga in the sky. So this drone use AI, and this is how exactly this drone works. So first you need to show this drone probably a target in the sky, and then you can release the drone and drone began hunting. So in this video we can see how Russians sent a drone with the purpose to destroy reconnaissance drone that was flying above the territory of the Russian Federation. And when the drone discovered the target, it destroyed Ukrainian drone immediately. So this is the situation, and this is the first video that was published by the Russians during the previous 48 hours. This is obviously a game changer drone, because if the Russians are able to start producing hundreds of these drones, this can lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian air superiority, if they have ever any drone superiority, and the Russians will establish their own drone superiority. In this video we can see another episode how the Russians were using this anti-drone drone. Ukrainians sent most likely another reconnaissance drone that was flying above probably the city of Selidova, or probably somewhere in the vicinity of Pokrovsk, but then the Russians sent this anti-drone drone, and this drone destroyed the Ukrainian one. So this is very interesting, and we expect that we're going to see more and more videos of this type. As for now, we know for sure that Ukrainians have almost the same technology, but when talking about the Ukrainian side, they haven't published lots of videos of this type. But the Russians, as we can see, began publishing more and more videos of this type. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kliban-Byksky pocket, or along the N32 road. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly. But before we start discussing the situation inside of this pocket itself and along N32 road, I would like to remind you once again that Ukrainians are going to establish their defense and their, let's say, tactic or their strategic position to defend the Pokrovsk and the Konstantinovka-Kramatorsk agglomeration based on supply and logistic roads between these two agglomerations. So if we return back to map, currently there are several very important logistic roads. We've discussed the situation a lot since the beginning of May. So this is the first logistic road that goes from the settlement of Kramatorsk further in the southwestern direction, first towards the city of Drapilya, and then Dobrapilya, and then from the settlement of Dobrapilya in the southern directions to the village of Rodinska, and then in the direction of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. So this is the first, the most important road that Ukrainians are trying to use for defense purposes. The next supply line goes from this Pokrovsk agglomeration through the village of Belitsky, but in the eastern direction, through the settlement of Shahtova, and then in the northeastern direction towards the set city of Drushkovka. So this is the next supply line, and based on these two supply lines, the Ukrainians are planning to establish probably very, very powerful defense. But the Ukrainians probably didn't count that the Russians, by the time the Russians answer this phase of the special military operation, are able to create their own drones and their own weapon that can cut these two supply lines without any problems. For example, during the previous 24 hours, we got very important video from the settlement of Shakhova. Not the video, but the picture. In this picture, we can see consequences of Russian missile strike. And according to information we have, the Russians managed to damage this bridge. Of course, when talking about these photos, the bridge wasn't destroyed, obviously. But if you remember the situation in the city of Kherson and around the Antonovsky bridge, the situation was similar. The Ukrainians first attacked the bridge with HIMARS missile then they attack another time, then they attack 2 more times, and probably by 100th attack the bridge was completely damaged and destroyed, and the Russians were forced to fall back from this bank of the river. So most likely the Russians are planning to do the same thing in this area. They will attack this bridge every single day, trying to destroy and trying to reduce this area till ruins. Of course, it will not stop the Ukrainians. They will build a lot of pontoon bridges in the same area with the purpose to diverse their logistic, but obviously their logistic or the quality of their logistic would be reduced. At the same time, the Russians continue hunting and destroying Ukrainian vehicles along TO4 or TO514 road. Today we got another video that was published by the Ukrainians, and in this video we can see how another vehicle, probably civilians, were moving along this road, and they managed to film a moment when another Ukrainian probably bus or truck with arms or equipment was destroyed as a result of Russian FPV drone attack. So I'll remind you, and telling the truth, we've discussed the situation for many times since the beginning of May, and if we increase the numbers of days since the 11th of May of 2025, we're going to see that the Russians have a certain focus exactly in this area. The Russians are trying to destroy and to bomb not just the roads itself, the Russians are trying to damage and to destroy as many as possible Ukrainian vehicles and bases around these roads, because the Ukrainians are trying to keep their reserves in this area. For example, Ukrainians, and most likely the Ukrainians, have their main resources and main reserves in this, let's say, pocket. And if the situation becomes critical in the area of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians are sending their reserves in the southern direction. If the situation becomes critical, let's say, in the area of Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, Konstantinovka, the Ukrainians are sending their reinforcements using these roads. So obviously, if the Russians are able to establish complete control over this territory, Ukrainians will suffer huge losses and huge problems while defending and while trying to protect the settlements of Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, Pokrovsk, and the Kliban-Byksky water reservoir. The Russians realize and understand everything clearly, and this is exactly what the Russians are trying to establish right now. Now let's continue with the Russian breakthrough. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions. First of all, according to neutral mappers and according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village of Yelizavetovka. I'll remind you that these territories were taken by the Russians probably 2 or 3 weeks ago, according to the report of the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. So that is why we're not changing anything on the map. But anyway, this is very important because despite the gap between Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, neutral and pro-Ukraine mappers, we see that the Russians are trying to advance in this direction. So the Russians most likely during the next weeks will try to take under control this complex network of the fortifications between villages of Yelizavetovka, Mirolyubovka, and Malinovka. So they will try to take under control these territories because this is going to be very powerful and very important base and foothold before further offensive operation in the direction of Novo Ekonomichne. So we expect that the next week or two the Russians will be focused extremely on this area, on the southeastern flank of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. At the same time, the Russians continue their breakthrough in the northern directions towards the villages of Popov Yar, Poltavka, and Rusin Yar. During the previous 24 hours, according to different mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly. As of the end of the 20th of May of 2025, we still haven't received even a single report that can confirm Russian control over the settlement of Nova Poltavka. I'll remind you that despite the fact that we got a lot of flags from the south and from the central and from the most western parts of the village, we still haven't received anything from the most northern part, which means that most likely there is still pocket of resistance with Ukrainian soldiers inside of this pocket. So we expect that the Russians during the next 48 hours will clear this pocket, and most likely then the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm this information. Furthermore, I'll remind you that according to different pro-Russian resources, probably the Edge Sabotage and Reconnaissance Group of the Armored Forces of the Russian Federation during the previous 48 hours managed to reach the outskirts of Poltavka. As of the end of the 20th of May of 2025, we still haven't received anything that can confirm this situation. Pro-Ukrainian sources reported that the Armored Forces of the Russian Federation have pressed Novopoltovka, unfortunately, according to Ukrainians. So today, for the first time since the beginning of battle for Novopoltavka, pro-Ukrainian sources confirmed complete control over this village by the Russians. Furthermore, the same very reliable pro-Ukrainian resource reported that the Russians are about to finish the battle for the village of Leonidovka. The village of Leonidovka is the territory in the area between Toretsk, Nelipovka, and Sherbinovka. Now let's talk about the pocket itself. The Russians during the previous 24 hours continue advancing, and as usually these days the Russians improve their positions mainly on the western flank. Several more tree lines and fortifications were taken by the Russians. This information was confirmed by neutral mappers. The Russians at the same time continue attacking Ukrainian positions further in the northeastern direction, in the direction of the village of Yablunovka and in the village of Alexandra Kalinova. The Russians establish complete FPV drone control. The Russians destroy everything they see, and then the Russian infantry take empty positions. As for the most southern part of the pocket, today we got very huge change on the ground, very huge configuration, change of the configuration of the map. According to several pro-Russian resources and according to pro-Ukrainian resources, we see that the most southern part of the Kliban-Byksky pocket was colored as a contested area or the gray zone. So let's compare the map between the dates. This is the situation by the end of the 19th of May of 2025. As you can see, the southern territories were considered as the area under complete Ukrainian control, but by the end of the 20th of May of 2025, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the situation here has been changed, and according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the most southern part of the pocket is already a gray zone. So which means that it doesn't mean that the Russians managed to enter this territory and to capture all these tree lines under complete control. I believe that first of all, this report of pro-Ukrainian resource means that Ukrainians decided to abandon their positions completely and to retreat towards more reliable positions in the northern direction. So, and I'll remind you that during the previous days, the Russians managed to establish or to answer the village of Romanovka, and currently there are very heavy clashes for this village. And Ukrainians understand that if the Russians are able to establish complete control over this territory and to move further in the western direction, the Ukrainians who are currently located in the most southern part of the cauldron would be caught completely without any possibilities for evacuation. So that is why we see that Ukrainians don't have much time, and they decided to abandon and to quit these positions right now, today, and most likely during the 20th and the 21st of May, the Ukrainians will remove almost every single unit from this pocket. They will keep just rearguard forces that most likely would be caught by the Russians in cauldron completely. So we expect that during the next 72 hours, the southern pocket would collapse completely and would be taken by the Russians. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Konstantinovka direction. Let's talk about the situation in the along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal. The Russians improved their positions, and the Russians during the previous 24 hours took under control additional tree lines and fortifications in this area. So we have made small adjustments according to pro-Ukrainian, pro-neutral resources. Furthermore, at the same time, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the north in Lyivka, and this is the main task for the Russians, to take this village under complete control. As you can see, according to this video, the village of north in Lyivka was already reduced to ruins, but there are still several pockets of resistance from the Ukrainian side and several very important strongholds, and the Russians are fighting for these strongholds right now. So we expect that the Russians most likely will try to improve their positions and to get as close as possible to this settlement during the next 72 hours. As for now, the Russians have several tasks: to finish the battle for the railway station of the south in Lyivka and to take under control these two company strongholds. Based on these fortifications, the Russians will be able to move further in the northern direction towards the village of Lyivka itself. As for the Chasiv Yar direction, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special. The Russians were bombing and attacking Ukrainian positions on the territory of the city of Konstantinovka itself and on the territory around the settlement. Lots of losses, lots of damage the Russians dealt with total power systems, with aviation, and the most important thing is that the Russians improved their positions along canal itself. In this video, we can see how Ukrainians were attacking the Russians along Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal, which means that this tree line on the Ukrainian side of canal is already under complete Russian control. I'll remind you that during the previous days, we were talking a lot that most likely the Russians will try to improve their positions along this canal with the purpose to have better positions and to have better possibilities to accumulate additional critical mass. As for the Sivir direction, the Russians during the previous 24 hours improved their positions. The Russians continued their outflanking operation, and the Russians took under control this true line completely. Most likely now the Russians will try to outflank the village of Verkhnyi Kaminska from the north and from the northwest with the purpose to take under complete control of this block. At the same time, according to several mappers, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the farms that are located in the central part of this settlement. So we see that the Russians are trying to tighten the noose around Ukraine positions, and we expect that Ukrainians would be forced to fall back from this area in the very near future. We're not talking about months or days, but obviously during 1 or 2 weeks the battle for Verkhnyi Kaminska would be finished. And then the Russians will have very small distance between their possible edge positions in the western part of Verkhnyi Kaminska and the city of Siversk itself. These positions, if the Russians are able to take under control these positions, this will mean the beginning of the battle for the Siversk itself. Most likely by the time the Russians enter the western part of Verkhnyi Kaminska, they will try to finish the battle for Grigorovka and to block the Ukrainian contingent on the territory of Serebryanka, with the purpose to cut and to split this territory into many pieces. This will allow the Russians to handle with every single, let's say, piece separately. As for the Lyman direction, when talking about the village of Redkadub, we still haven't received anything. Most likely there are very heavy clashes for the settlement, but as you can see, without any changes on the ground. As for now, the Russians are trying to focus themselves on the area of the village of Zaporizhzhia. Almost every single day we receive another video how the Russians destroy or attack another temporary deployment point of the armored forces of Ukraine or another warehouse in this area. In this video we can see a Murat strike with missile type of Lurmur type, and as a result of this attack this building was damaged and destroyed. If we increase the numbers of days since the beginning of May, I would like to point your attention that we have a lots of icons, mainly FAB strikes and Lurmur strikes, which means that the Russians are preparing this village before the beginning of the ground operation, which most likely is going to start very soon. As for the central and as for the northern directions of Kupiansk, we haven't received anything special. Just regular activities, attempts to counterattack from Ukrainian side, failed attempts, several artillery systems were destroyed, several tanks and vehicles were damaged and destroyed as well. So some activity we can see in this area. Most likely the Ukrainians were trying to counterattack the Russians with the purpose to restore control over several positions, but most likely according to this video, all Ukrainian attempts failed. As for the northern directions, we see that the Russians resumed their attempts to move deep inside of this Sumi region. Today, according to information we have, the Russians managed to restore completely the territory along the border between the villages of Grafovka and Prelesya. So these are the changes on the ground. I'll remind you that several days ago the Russians reported about complete control of the village of Marina, and now we see that the next target for the Russians is to move further in the direction of Turia, and this is already a settlement on the territory of Sumi, deep inside of Sumi, not like probably along the border, better to say. When talking about the Sumi direction, original Sumi direction itself, the most important updates are coming from the village of Loknya. And most likely today the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over this territory. In this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking with drones Russian edge positions in the southern part of the settlement. Based on this video, we found 2 geolocations. We have adjusted the map. Furthermore, a bit later, probably an hour before I start making this video, several sources reported that the Russians secured the village of Loknya completely and that the Russians began the battle for the village of Yunakievka. Yunakievka is a very important village, and most likely the Russians will try to take this village under complete control, which will force the Ukrainians to fall back from the territory to the east of Yunakievka almost until the border with the Russian Federation. And this is going to be already a part of secure zone that the president of the Russian Federation was talking about. As for the Tyotkina direction, during the previous 24 hours, nothing special, just several videos how the Russians were bombing and attacking positions of the armed forces of Ukraine along the border. For example, based on this video, made small adjustments on the map in Ukrainian favor, which means that most likely this small forest is under complete Ukrainian control. But anyway, despite the fact that this forest is under complete Ukrainian control, we see that Ukrainian activities in this area were reduced almost to zero. The Ukrainians probably tried to carry out counterattacks or attacks in this direction, but without any results. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes during my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.